The deafening roar of the swollen river echoed across the valley as Thatcher stood at the edge of the muddy bank, his worn leather boots sinking into the soft earth. The spring of 1873 had brought relentless rains to the Dakota Territory, turning the usually manageable Missouri River into a raging beast that had just swallowed his best friend whole before his very eyes. "Thomas!" Finn screamed, his voice cracking as he scanned the churning waters. The morning sun glinted off the rapids, nearly blinding him as he frantically searched for any sign of his childhood friend. They had been attempting to cross at what was normally a shallow ford, driving a small herd of cattle back to their homestead outside of Fargo when the weakened bank had collapsed beneath Thomas's horse. In an instant, both horse and rider had been swept away by the current, disappearing around the bend before Finn could even process what had happened. He ran alongside the bank for nearly a mile, calling out until his voice was hoarse, but found nothing. The remaining cattle bellowed nervously behind him, still clustered at the river's edge. Finn knew he needed to get them home, but the thought of leaving felt like betrayal. After another hour of desperate searching, reality began to sink in. Thomas was gone. With a heavy heart, Finn gathered the spooked cattle and began the slow journey back to town. The small settlement of Fargo was still in its infancy, barely more than a collection of wooden structures perched on the edge of the vast prairie, but it was home. As he approached the familiar buildings, he dreaded what came next, telling Flora. Flora Garrison had been waiting at Thomas's small cabin on the edge of town since daybreak. The men had promised to return with the cattle by noon, and as the sun climbed higher in the sky with no sign of them, a sense of unease had settled in her stomach. She paced the porch, occasionally pausing to scan the horizon, her hand shielding her eyes from the bright spring sun. When she finally spotted the dust cloud in the distance, Flora's heart leapt. But as the figures drew closer, her momentary relief transformed into dread. There was only one rider. Finn's face told her everything before he even dismounted. His normally bright blue eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, his usual easygoing demeanor replaced by a grief so palpable it seemed to hang in the air between them. "The river," was all he managed to say as he stood before her, hat in hand. Flora felt the world tilt beneath her feet. Thomas had been her best friend since childhood, the one constant in her life through every hardship. They had grown up together, the three of them, Finn, Flora, and Thomas, inseparable since they were old enough to run wild across the prairie. "No," she whispered, shaking her head. "No, you're mistaken. He's a strong swimmer." "The current was too powerful," Finn said, his voice breaking. "His horse lost footing at the crossing. I tried to reach him, Flora. I swear to God I tried." Flora's legs gave out and she sank down onto the porch steps. She couldn't cry as shock numbed her from the inside out. "They could have washed up downstream," she said suddenly, rising to her feet. "We need to search," Finn nodded, having expected this reaction. "I'll gather some men from town. We'll start immediately." As word spread through Fargo, a search party formed. Men on horseback rode out along both sides of the river for miles, looking for any sign of Thomas or his horse. Flora insisted on joining them despite Finn's protests, her determination overpowering her grief. For 3 days they searched. For 3 days they found nothing. Hope dwindled with each passing hour, and on the evening of the 3rd day, the town's sheriff gently suggested they call off the search. "The river's taken him too far by now," Sheriff Branson said, his weathered face creased with sympathy. "I'm sorry, Miss Garrison, but we need to accept what's happened." Flora stood at the river's edge as twilight painted the sky in deepening shades of purple. The others had returned to town, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. This river had taken Thomas, and something inside her refused to walk away. "You should come back to town," Finn said softly, appearing at her side. He had returned after taking the other searchers to Fargo. "It'll be dark soon." "I can't," Flora replied, her voice barely audible above the rush of the water. "What if he's out there, hurt, waiting for someone to find him?" Finn placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Flora, we've searched every inch for miles. The current was too strong." "Then I'll wait here," she said with sudden resolve, her green eyes reflecting the last light of day. "I'll wait right here until he comes home." Finn stared at her in disbelief. "You can't stay out here alone, it's not safe." "I don't care," she replied. "I'm not leaving." Realizing the futility of arguing, Finn rode back to town and returned an hour later with blankets, food, and a small tent. If Flora was determined to keep vigil by the river, he wouldn't let her do it alone. That first night by the riverbank was the beginning of what would become a ritual. Each morning, Flora would walk along the shore, searching for any sign of Thomas. Each evening, she would sit by a small fire, staring out at the water as if willing it to return what it had taken. Days turned into a week. Finn would ride out every morning from his small ranch outside of town, bringing fresh supplies and news. He had his own grief to contend with. Thomas had been like a brother to him, but he channeled his pain into caring for Flora and maintaining both his ranch and Thomas's small homestead. "People in town are talking," Finn said one evening as they sat by the fire. 10 days had passed since Thomas was lost to the river. "They think you've gone mad with grief." Flora poked at the flames with a stick. "Let them talk. I'm not leaving until I find him. And if you never do." Finn asked gently. Flora looked up at him, her face illuminated by the dancing firelight. "Then I suppose I'll be here a very long time." As the days passed, Flora's vigil became something of a local legend, the woman who waited by the river. Some found it romantic, others tragic, but all agreed it spoke to a devotion few had witnessed before. Spring turned to summer and still Flora waited. She had moved her camp slightly back from the water's edge as the river receded to more normal levels. But she remained, her eyes constantly scanning the shoreline and waters. Finn visited daily without fail, gradually bringing more comforts to make her self-imposed exile bearable. A proper canvas tent replaced the makeshift shelter. A cooking grate appeared over her fire pit. Books arrived to help pass the long hours. "You've built me a proper homestead," Flora remarked one July afternoon as Finn unloaded a rocking chair from his wagon. "People will think I'm never coming back." "Are you?" he asked, setting the chair in a shady spot beneath a cottonwood tree. Flora didn't answer, but her silence spoke volumes. By August, Flora's camp had become an established fixture on the riverbank. Some of the town's women would visit occasionally, bringing food and company, though most didn't understand her refusal to accept what seemed obvious to everyone else. Thomas was gone. Only Finn seemed to truly understand that her vigil was not merely about hope, but about loyalty. Flora and Thomas had been orphaned young, she at 12, he at 14, and had relied on each other ever since. To abandon her post would feel like abandoning the only family she'd known for most of her life. "Summer won't last forever," Finn reminded her one evening as they watched fireflies dance along the river's edge. "The winter here is brutal. You can't stay when the snow comes." "I've lived through Dakota winters before," Flora replied stubbornly. Finn sighed, running a hand through his sandy brown hair. "Not in a tent by a riverbank, you haven't." Flora turned to look at him, studying the face that had become so familiar over these months of shared grief. Finn had changed since Thomas's death. The carefree cowboy had been replaced by a more solemn, responsible man. He now managed both his own ranch and kept Thomas's small homestead from falling into disrepair, all while faithfully visiting her each day. "Why do you come here every day, Finn?" she asked suddenly. The question seemed to catch him off guard. "Because you're here," he said simply. Their eyes met in the fading light, and for a moment, something unspoken passed between them. A shared grief, yes, but something else too, a connection that had always been there but had somehow deepened in Thomas's absence. The moment was broken by the distant howl of a coyote. Finn stood, brushing dust from his trousers. "I should head back before dark. I'll bring more firewood tomorrow." As August gave way to September, the first hints of autumn crept into the air. The cottonwood leaves began to turn golden, and the mornings grew crisp. Flora's routine remained unchanged, but Finn noticed she had begun collecting deadwood and stocking it near her tent. "You really are planning to stay through winter," he remarked one day, helping her arrange the wood into a neat pile. "I made a promise," she replied simply. "To Thomas or to yourself?" Flora paused, considering the question. "Both, I suppose." Finn nodded, then straightened. "If you're determined to stay, you'll need more than a tent." He gestured to the surrounding trees. "There's good timber here. I could build you a proper shelter." Flora looked up at him in surprise. "You do that?" "I would," he said, his voice soft but determined. "I'll start tomorrow." True to his word, Finn arrived the next morning with his wagon loaded with tools and supplies. For the next 2 weeks, he spent every available hour constructing a small, sturdy cabin near Flora's camp. Other men from town occasionally helped, partly out of kindness and partly out of curiosity about the woman who refused to leave the riverbank. By early October, the cabin was complete, a simple one-room structure with a stone fireplace, a bed, and a small table with 2 chairs. It was basic but sound and would keep out the bitter Dakota winter winds. "It's perfect," Flora said, standing in the doorway of her new home. For the first time in months, tears filled her eyes. "I don't know how to thank you." "You don't need to," Finn replied, placing a hand on her shoulder. "Thomas would have wanted you to be safe." The mention of Thomas's name still brought a sharp pain to both of them, but it had become possible to speak of him without being completely overwhelmed by grief. As autumn progressed, the river continued to recede, revealing new stretches of shoreline that Flora meticulously searched each day. Though she no longer expected to find Thomas alive, she held onto the hope of at least recovering his body, of having a proper place to lay him to rest. One bitterly cold November morning, Finn arrived to find Flora standing on a newly exposed sandbar, something clutched in her hands. He waded through the shallow water to reach her, his breath forming clouds in the frigid air. "What is it?" he asked as he approached. Flora turned to him, her face pale. In her hands was a tarnished silver pocket Thomas's watch, the one his father had given him before he died. The glass was cracked and the hands had stopped at precisely 10:17. "It was his," she whispered, her voice breaking. "It was his time." Finn took the watch from her trembling hands, recognizing it immediately. The engraved initials on the back confirmed what they both already knew. "He's really gone," Flora said, and for the first time since that terrible day in spring, she broke down completely. "Great!" Heaving sobs racked her body as months of suspended grief finally found release. Finn pulled her into his arms, holding her tightly as she cried. His own tears mingled with hers as they mourned together on that cold sandbar, the river flowing silently past them. The watch became both an ending and a beginning. With this tangible proof of Thomas's fate, Flora could finally begin to accept what had happened. They held a proper memorial service in the small church in Fargo, where the entire town gathered to pay their respects. The watch was placed in a small wooden box that Finn had carved and buried on a hill overlooking the river. "Will you come back to town now?" Sheriff Branson asked Flora after the service. She shook her head. "The river is where I belong now." Some thought her decision madness, but those who knew her best understood. It wasn't just about waiting anymore. The river had become her home, a place where she felt closest to Thomas's memory. As winter descended upon the Dakota territory, Flora settled into her small cabin. Finn continued his daily visits, bringing supplies and companionship. On days when the weather was too severe for him to make the journey from his ranch, Flora found herself watching the path from town with increasing anxiety, only relaxing when his familiar figure appeared on the horizon. One particularly harsh December day, a blizzard swept across the plains without warning. Finn had arrived earlier that morning but had delayed his departure, concerned about the darkening sky. By midday, visibility had dropped to nearly nothing, and the temperature had plummeted. "You'll have to stay," Flora said, stoking the fire in the small cabin. "Trying to get back to your ranch in this would be suicide." Finn nodded, peering out the frosted window at the swirling white. Looks like we're both trapped for the duration." They spent the day in comfortable companionship, Finn whittling by the fire while Flora read aloud from one of the books he had brought her months earlier. As darkness fell, the storm intensified, wind howling around the small cabin and rattling the shutters. "It's a good thing we built this place sturdy," Finn remarked, adding another log to the fire. Flora questioned with a raised eyebrow. Finn smiled. "Fine, I built it, but you supervised very effectively." For the first time in months, Flora laughed a genuine, unguarded sound that surprised them both. It felt strange, almost wrong, to experience joy after so much sorrow, but also strangely liberating. As the evening wore on, they shared stories of Thomas, remembering the good times rather than dwelling on his tragic end. They recalled childhood adventures, practical jokes, and the trouble the three of them had gotten into as young people in a frontier town. "Remember when he tried to impress Mary Wilson by riding that unbroken Mustang?" Finn chuckled. Flora smiled at the memory. "He couldn't walk straight for a week afterward, but he got her attention. For all the wrong reasons," they laughed together, finding comfort in shared memories. When it grew late, Finn prepared to sleep on the floor near the fire, but Flora hesitated. "It's too cold for that," she said quietly. "The bed is large enough for both of us." Finn looked at her uncertainly. "Are you sure?" Flora nodded. "We're friends, Finn. There's no impropriety in staying warm." They lay back to back under the heavy quilts, a respectful distance between them despite the narrow bed. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside the cabin, a different kind of warmth began to grow. The storm lasted 3 days, keeping them confined to the small cabin. By the time the skies cleared, something had shifted between them. Neither spoke of it, but both felt it a comfort in each other's presence that went beyond mere friendship. When Finn finally departed for his ranch, Flora found herself standing in the doorway long after he disappeared from sight, already anticipating his return. The winter of 1874 was one of the harshest in memory. Snow piled high around Flora's cabin, and the river froze solid enough to walk across. Despite the severe conditions, Finn never failed to visit, sometimes trudging through waist-deep snow to reach her. On Christmas Day, he arrived with a small pine tree strapped to his back and a burlap sack of modest gifts. They decorated the tree with strings of dried berries and paper stars Flora had cut from the pages of an old catalog, then shared a simple meal of rabbit stew and corn bread. "I have something for you," Flora said after they had eaten, reaching beneath her bed to retrieve a carefully wrapped package. "It isn't much." Finn unwrapped the gift to find a woolen scarf finely knitted in a pattern of dark blue and gray. "You made this?" he asked, running his fingers over the soft material. Flora nodded. "Mrs. Peterson from town brought me the yarn and taught me how. I've had plenty of time to practice." Finn wrapped the scarf around his neck, genuinely touched by the gesture. "It's perfect, thank you." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small wooden box. "I have something for you too." Inside the box was a delicate silver locket. Flora gasped softly as she opened it to find a tiny sketch of Thomas on one side, clearly done from memory by a skilled hand. "How did you? There's an artist who passed through Fargo last month," Finn explained. "I described Thomas to him as best I could. I know it's not exactly right," but Flora cut him off by throwing her arms around his neck, the locket clutched tightly in her hand. "It's wonderful," she whispered against his shoulder. "Thank you." When she pulled back, their faces were inches apart. For a moment, neither moved. Then, slowly, Finn leaned forward and pressed his lips gently to hers. The kiss was brief and hesitant, and when they separated, Flora's eyes were wide with surprise not at Finn's actions, but at her own response. She had not pushed him away. Instead, she had found herself wanting to draw him closer. "I'm sorry," Finn said immediately, misreading her expression. "I shouldn't have known," Flora interrupted, placing her hand on his. "Don't apologize, I wasn't expecting to feel." "What? Anything," she admitted. After Thomas, I thought I'd never feel anything again. Finn nodded, understanding completely. I know, me too. They sat in silence for a long moment, hands still touching on the rough wooden table. Is it wrong? Flora finally asked. To find comfort in each other when he's gone, Finn considered the question carefully. Thomas loved us both, he said at last. I don't think he'd begrudge us finding happiness even if it's with each other. Flora nodded slowly but withdrew her hand. I need time, Finn, this is all very… Of course, he said quickly. There's no rush, we have time. The kiss wasn't mentioned again, but it lingered between them like a promise or perhaps a question waiting to be answered. As winter gradually loosened its grip on the land, life along the river began to change. The ice broke up with thunderous cracks that echoed through the valley, and the first tentative shoots of green appeared on the riverbank. Flora continued her daily ritual of walking along the shore, though her searches had become more contemplative than desperate. She had accepted that Thomas was truly gone, but the river still called to her each day, drawing her to its edge like an old friend with secrets to share. One warm spring day, almost exactly a year after Thomas had been swept away, Flora was gathering early wildflowers along the bank when she spotted something unusual caught in a tangle of driftwood. Drawing closer, she saw it was leather, the remains of a saddle, weathered and water-stained. With trembling hands, she pulled it from the debris. There was no doubt it was Thomas's saddle, the distinctive stamped pattern on the fender unmistakable despite the damage. She sank to her knees, clutching the remnant to her chest as a fresh wave of grief washed over her. When Finn found her there hours later, she was still holding the saddle, but her tears had dried. It's the last piece of him, she said as Finn knelt beside her. The river's given back everything it can. Finn nodded, helping her to her feet. Maybe it's the river's way of saying goodbye. They carried the saddle back to the cabin together and placed it carefully beside the door. That night, as they sat by the fire, Flora made a decision she had been considering for weeks. I think it's time I return to town, she said quietly. Finn looked up in surprise. You're leaving the river. Not leaving, she corrected. Just not living on its bank anymore. I've been thinking about Thomas's homestead sitting empty all these months. It seems wrong somehow. Finn was silent for a long moment. Are you sure you're ready? Flora nodded. I'll never stop missing him, but I can't spend the rest of my life waiting for something I know won't happen. She paused, gathering her courage, and there are other reasons to go back to living. Their eyes met across the fire, and Finn understood what she wasn't saying. I'll help you move whenever you're ready, he said simply. The return to Fargo caused quite a stir. Many had assumed Flora would remain by the river indefinitely, her vigil becoming as much a part of the landscape as the cottonwood trees that lined the shore. Her reappearance in town was met with a mixture of surprise and relief. Thomas's cabin had been maintained by Finn throughout the year, so it required little work to make it livable again. As Flora settled back into town life, she found herself drawn to the schoolhouse, where she began assisting the overworked teacher with the younger children. You have a gift for teaching, Mrs. Winters told her one afternoon as they watched the children file out at day's end. You should consider taking it up properly. Flora was surprised to find the idea appealing. She had never given much thought to a profession before, but working with the children gave her a sense of purpose she had been missing. Finn still visited daily, though now he came to town rather than to the riverbank. Their relationship continued to deepen, though both were careful not to rush. The memory of Thomas remained strong between them, but increasingly it became a bond rather than a barrier. One Sunday afternoon in late summer, Finn invited Flora to ride out to his ranch, something he had never done before. As they approached the modest homestead nestled against a backdrop of rolling hills, Flora was struck by how much it reminded her of Finn himself, unpretentious, solid, and welcoming. It's lovely, she said as he helped her down from her horse. It's not much, Finn replied with characteristic modesty, but it's mine. I've added 10 acres since spring and the herd is growing. Another year or two and I might actually be able to call myself a successful rancher." He showed her around the property with obvious pride, the sturdy barn, the small herd of cattle grazing in the distance, the vegetable garden he had started that spring. Everything spoke of careful planning and hard work. "You've built something wonderful here," Flora said as they ended their tour at the edge of a small pond behind the house. Finn looked at her intently. "It still feels empty sometimes." The implication hung in the air between them. Flora's heart quickened as Finn took her hands in his. "I've been wanting to ask you something," he said, his voice uncharacteristically nervous. "I've been waiting for the right time and I'm not sure there ever is one, but—" He took a deep breath. "Flora, would you consider making this your home too, as my wife?" Flora felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were not tears of sorrow. For the first time in over a year, they were tears of joy. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I would." The kiss they shared by the pond was different from their Christmas kiss, confident and full of promise rather than hesitant and questioning. They were married in October, when the prairie was painted in golds and reds. The entire town turned out for the wedding, held in the small church where they had memorialized Thomas a year earlier. During the ceremony, Flora wore the locket Finn had given her, feeling Thomas's presence not as a ghost but as a blessing. In her heart, she knew he would have approved. Their first months as husband and wife were filled with the joy of discovery and the comfort of deep friendship. Flora brought warmth and laughter to Finn's quiet ranch, while he provided the stability and devotion she had never expected to find again after Thomas. By the following spring, Flora had turned Thomas's homestead into a small schoolhouse, with the town's blessing. 3 days a week, she taught the children of the outlying farms who couldn't make the daily journey into Fargo. The other days, she helped Finn with the ranch, learning the business of cattle raising with the same determination she applied to everything. One warm May evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sunset paint the prairie in fiery hues, Flora took Finn's hand and placed it gently on her stomach. "There will be 3 of us by winter," she said softly. Finn's expression transformed from confusion to wonder in an instant. "A baby." "Are you certain?" Flora nodded, smiling at his reaction. "The doctor confirmed it yesterday when I was in town. I wanted to be sure before I told you." Finn gathered her into his arms, his joy too great for words. As they held each other, both thought of the long journey that had brought them to this moment, a journey that had begun in tragedy, but had somehow led to profound happiness. The months that followed were busy ones. Finn threw himself into preparing the ranch for the coming child, adding a nursery to their home and fussing over Flora in a way that alternately touched and exasperated her. "I'm with child, not made of glass," she reminded him one day when he tried to prevent her from carrying a basket of eggs from the henhouse. "Humor me," he replied with a grin. "It's my first time at this." As her pregnancy progressed, Flora continued teaching as long as she could, reluctant to abandon her students even temporarily. By December, however, she finally agreed to stay closer to home, focusing instead on preparing for the baby's arrival. The winter of 1875 was milder than the previous year, for which they were both grateful. Still, when Flora went into labor during a January snowstorm, Finn was frantic with worry. The doctor might not make it through the snow, he fretted as Flora paced the bedroom, breathing through contractions. "Women have been having babies without doctors since the beginning of time," Flora assured him, though her own confidence wavered as her labor intensified. In the end, their nearest neighbor, Mrs. Johansson, arrived to help, having received Finn's desperate message. Under her experienced guidance, Flora gave birth to a healthy baby boy just after midnight. "He has your eyes," Flora whispered as she cradled their son in the pre-dawn hours, Finn sitting beside her on the bed, his arm protectively around them both. "And your determination," Finn replied, watching in awe as the tiny infant gripped his finger with surprising strength. "What shall we name him?" Flora met his gaze, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. Thomas, she said softly. Thomas Thatcher. Finn nodded, emotion making it difficult to speak. Thomas, he agreed, running a gentle finger over the baby's downy head. It's perfect. As young Thomas grew, so did the ranch. Finn's hard work and business acumen began to pay off, and by the time their son was toddling around the yard, they had become one of the more prosperous homesteads in the area. Flora eventually returned to teaching, bringing little Thomas with her to the schoolhouse. The arrangement worked well until the spring of 1878, when she discovered she was expecting their second child. Another Thatcher to help run the ranch, Finn said proudly when she told him the news. Or perhaps a daughter to keep you on your toes, Flora teased. Their daughter, Sarah, arrived in November, a quiet, thoughtful baby with her father's sandy hair and her mother's green eyes. 3-year-old Thomas took to his role as big brother with great seriousness, solemnly explaining the workings of the ranch to the infant as though she could understand every word. Life fell into a pleasant rhythm. The ranch prospered, the children grew, and Flora and Finn's love deepened with each passing year. They faced hardships, of course drought years that threatened the herd, a fire that destroyed part of the barn, illnesses that swept through the family, but they weathered each storm together, their bond only strengthening through adversity. On the 5th anniversary of their wedding, Finn surprised Flora with a special gift, a small plot of land by the river where she had kept her vigil, now transformed into a peaceful garden with a stone bench overlooking the water. I know you still go there sometimes, he said as they stood together in the autumn sunshine. I thought you might like having a proper place to sit and remember. Flora leaned her head against his shoulder, deeply touched by his understanding. It's beautiful, she whispered. Thank you. They visited the river garden together regularly after that, sometimes bringing the children, sometimes going alone. For Flora, it became a place not of grief but of reflection, a quiet spot to honor the past while embracing the present. As the years passed, Fargo grew from a small settlement to a bustling town. The railroad arrived, bringing new opportunities and connecting them more firmly to the wider world. The Thatcher Ranch expanded accordingly, becoming one of the largest operations in the territory. Thomas, now 10, had grown into a thoughtful, responsible boy with his mother's quiet determination and his father's practical nature. 7-year-old Sarah was bright and curious, constantly asking questions about everything from cattle breeding to the stars above. In the spring of 1886, Flora discovered she was expecting their third child, a surprise that delighted the entire family. This pregnancy was harder than her previous ones, perhaps because she was older now, and Finn hovered anxiously despite her assurances that she was fine. We've been blessed with an abundant life, she told him one evening as they sat on their porch, watching Thomas and Sarah chase fireflies in the gathering dusk. More than I ever thought possible after that terrible day at the river. Finn squeezed her hand, understanding exactly what she meant. He brought us together in a way, he said softly. Even in his absence, Thomas was looking out for us. Their third child, a son they named James, arrived in early autumn, a robust baby with a powerful set of lungs that announced his presence to the world in no uncertain terms. He'll be the one to keep us on our toes, Finn predicted as he paced the floor with the howling infant one night, giving Flora a much-needed rest. He was right. James grew into an adventurous, sometimes reckless boy who tested his parents' patience, but filled their lives with laughter and excitement. By the time he was 5, he had already fallen into the creek twice, broken his arm climbing the barn roof, and gone missing for several heart-stopping hours only to be found fast asleep in the hayloft. He reminds me of you, Flora remarked to Finn after one such episode. Always charging ahead without looking, Finn raised an eyebrow. I seem to recall it was usually Thomas who led the way into trouble, with me following and you being the sensible one. Flora smiled at the memory. Perhaps, but you were certainly enthusiastic participants. The years continued their steady march. Thomas, at 17, began taking on more responsibility at the ranch, showing a natural aptitude for the business. Sarah excelled in school and dreamed of attending college in the East, a prospect that both terrified and thrilled her parents. James, now 12, had somewhat tempered his wild ways but still approached life with boundless energy. In the autumn of 1895, almost 23 years after Thomas had been swept away by the river, Flora received a letter that changed everything. It came from a woman in Missouri who claimed to have found a grave marker with Thomas's name while clearing an old plot of land near the Missouri River. "It can't be him," Finn said when she showed him the letter. "It's too far downstream, but what if it is?" Flora replied, her voice barely above a whisper. What if someone found him all those years ago and gave him a proper burial? The possibility was too compelling to ignore. After much discussion, they decided Finn would make the journey to investigate, while Flora remained at the ranch with the children. The 2 weeks of Finn's absence were some of the longest of Flora's life. She found herself drawn back to the river garden more frequently, sitting on the stone bench and staring out at the water as she had so many years before. When Finn finally returned, the expression on his face told her everything before he spoke a word. It was him, he confirmed, sitting beside her in their kitchen after the children had gone to bed. The grave was marked with his full name and the date of his death. The woman's grandfather found a body washed up on his property that spring, the silver watch still in the pocket. He buried him properly and marked the grave, but never knew who to notify. Flora sat in stunned silence, trying to process this revelation. After all these years, to know that Thomas had been found, that he hadn't simply vanished into the river without a trace, it brought both pain and peace. "I've made arrangements to have him reburied here," Finn continued gently. "Next to your garden by the river, I thought you might want that." Flora reached across the table and took his hand, her eyes brimming with tears of gratitude. "Yes," she said simply, "bring him home." The reburial was a quiet affair, attended only by the Thatcher family and a few of the older residents of Fargo who had known Thomas. As the simple wooden coffin was lowered into the ground overlooking the river, Flora felt a sense of completion, a circle closing after more than 2 decades. "He's finally home," she whispered to Finn as they stood together after the others had departed. Finn nodded, his arm tight around her waist. "Where he belongs." That night, as they lay in bed, Flora turned to Finn with a peacefulness he hadn't seen in her since before Thomas's death. "I kept my promise," she said softly. "I waited on the bank until he came home." Finn pulled her close, kissing her forehead gently. "You did, and now you can truly let him rest." The knowledge that Thomas had been found and properly laid to rest seemed to lift a weight from Flora's shoulders. Though she would always miss her childhood friend, the ache of his loss had transformed over the years into a gentle remembrance. Life continued its forward march. Thomas, their eldest, married a local girl and built a home on the ranch property, gradually taking over more of the day-to-day operations. Sarah fulfilled her dream of attending college back east, returning with a teaching degree and a fiancé who was quickly absorbed into the Thatcher fold. Even James eventually settled down, though not before spending several years riding with a cattle drive and having adventures that made his mother's hair turn gray. As Finn and Flora entered their later years, they found new joy in grandchildren, a growing brood of little ones who filled their home with noise and laughter. They would often take the oldest ones to the river garden, now a lush, beautiful spot with flowers blooming from spring through fall. "Who's buried here, Grandma?" asked little Emma, Sarah's daughter, one warm summer afternoon. Flora sat on the stone bench, the 6-year-old at her side. "A very dear friend," she answered. "Someone I loved very much who went away in the river but finally came home." "Is that why you and Grandpa built this garden, so he wouldn't be lonely?" Flora smiled, touched by the child's perception. "Yes, partly, and also to remember something important." "What's that?" Emma asked, her eyes wide with curiosity. "That sometimes when you lose something precious, you have to be patient," Flora explained. Sometimes you have to wait a very long time for things to come full circle, but they usually do in the end. Finn, who had been quietly listening, came to sit beside them. At 68, his hair was now completely white, but his blue eyes were as bright and kind as ever. "Your grandmother is the most patient person I've ever known," he told Emma with a warm smile. "She taught me that some things and some people are worth waiting for, no matter how long it takes." Flora reached for his hand, their fingers intertwining with the ease of long practice. After 43 years of marriage, they still found comfort in each other's touch, still shared the deep connection that had grown from friendship to love amid grief and hardship. That evening, as they walked slowly back to the ranch house, Flora paused to look back at the river, gleaming golden in the setting sun. "Do you ever wonder what might have happened if things had been different that day?" she asked Finn. "If the river hadn't risen, if the bank hadn't given way?" Finn considered the question carefully before answering. "Sometimes. But then I think about our children, our grandchildren, the life we've built together, and I can't wish for anything to have been different, even though I still miss him." Flora nodded, understanding completely. "It seems strange to think that our happiness grew from such sorrow." "Life is like the river," Finn said, gesturing toward the water that had shaped their story so profoundly. "It takes things away, but it also brings unexpected gifts. You just have to be willing to wait on the bank sometimes to receive them." Flora smiled, leaning into his embrace as they continued their walk home. "And I'm still waiting with you," she said softly, "after all these years." "Always," Finn replied, his voice filled with the certainty that had sustained them through decades together. "Always." As they approached their home, warm light spilling from the windows and the sounds of their family waiting inside, Flora knew that her long-ago vigil by the river had not been in vain. She had lost her oldest friend but found her greatest love, had experienced profound grief but also immeasurable joy. The river had taken, but it had also given, and in the end, it had brought Thomas home, completing a circle begun that terrible spring day so many years before. Together, hand in hand, Flora and Finn Thatcher walked toward the light and laughter of their home, their shared life a testament to the enduring power of patience, loyalty, and love.